Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The streets of Enugu had a rhythm of their own. Hustling horns by day, muffled generators at dusk, and the low whispers of night owls who traded gossip like it was currency. It was in this city of red dust and relentless ambition that Ma Ibekwe became a household name, not for anything noble or noteworthy, but because she mastered the fine art of presentation. In the heart of New Haven, where her parents lived in a modest flat with peeling paint and an unreliable water tank, Ma stood out like a peacock in a poultry farm. Every Sunday after church, she would strut down the road in 6-inch heels and imported wigs that bounced with each step. Her clothes were always ironed flat like a fresh 500 naira note, her lips painted with the kind of confidence only women who had rejected dozens of suitors possessed. She wasn't born with a silver spoon, maybe copper at best, but Ma swore she would never, ever taste poverty again. Not through struggle, but through strategy. While other girls in her age bracket were falling in love with up-and-coming musicians or final-year engineering students who still lived off their mother's cooking, Ma had a different plan carved in stone. Marry rich, live soft, die admired. That was her mantra, and she lived by it the way a priest lived by holy water. Ma didn't hide her disdain for women who settled. Her tongue had venom, and she spat it with a smile. She was the kind of woman who would attend a friend's bridal shower, just to mock the groom's job behind closed doors. How do you marry a man that earns 45,000 naira monthly in this Nigeria? What will you people be eating? Praise and worship, she once joked at a gathering, making her audience explode with laughter and shame all at once. And she didn't reserve her scorn for strangers. Even her childhood friend Chioma, who married a tailor with a small roadside shop in Abakpa, wasn't safe from Ma's snide remarks. "Your wedding gown was tighter than your husband's account balance," she said with a chuckle one afternoon, loud enough for ears that weren't supposed to hear. But Chioma never responded. People had long given up trying to humble Ma because her confidence was impenetrable, wrapped in layers of beauty, audacity, and something else, desperation. A desperation she masked so well, many mistook it for high standards. But beneath the glossy wigs and filtered Instagram posts was a woman in a constant war with herself, clawing her way out of the mediocrity she was born into. And then, like a long-awaited prophecy fulfilled, came Raymond Ease. Tall as a streetlight, dark-skinned with a face that looked permanently carved in stone, and eyes that spoke fluently in the language of money. He drove a black Range Rover with tinted windows that gave no clue about who or what sat inside. When he stepped out, time paused. Raymond wasn't the type of man you approached. He was the type of man women hoped would notice them. And Ma made sure he did. Their meeting wasn't anything poetic, just another Sunday at a high-end lounge in Independence layout. She wore red. He noticed. She laughed. He smiled. Numbers were exchanged. The rest, as they say, became Enugu's new favorite love story. Within 3 months, pictures of Ma clinking champagne glasses beside a man whose wristwatch alone could pay 10 years of rent in Thinker's Corner flooded social media. She had made it. She had caught the big fish. And just like that, she stopped picking calls from her old friends. Her WhatsApp status became a gallery of vacation clips, slow-motion walks through boutiques, and captions like "soft life or nothing." Nobody could say anything to her. Not anymore. She had beaten the system. She had arrived. The wedding was an event that shook the roots of Enugu's social scene. Held in a luxury hotel off Zik Avenue, with imported flowers and a live band flown in from Lagos, it was less of a wedding and more of a statement. A bold, unapologetic declaration that Ma had won. As she walked down the aisle in a gown that sparkled like crushed diamonds under soft lighting, every eye followed her with a mixture of admiration, envy, and curiosity. Her mother wept, not just from joy but relief. Her father, who once complained about her expensive taste, was now shaking hands with powerful men in Igbadas who called him sir. Ma's smile was permanent that day, like it had been ironed into her face. When the vows were exchanged and Raymond slipped a custom-designed ring on her finger, the applause was thunderous. Even Chioma, who sat quietly at the back in a simple blue gown, clapped with a tight smile. As the couple danced, surrounded by well-wishers and camera flashes, Ma leaned in to whisper something to her new husband, her eyes glinting with triumph. But those close enough to hear her words didn't miss it. "I told them I would never marry struggle," she said with a smirk, her hand resting gently on his chest. No one could argue. She had married money. But what she didn't know was that she had also married silence and shadows, and things too heavy to carry in a designer bag. That night, she slept beside her new husband in a suite scented with rose oil and wealth, thinking she had arrived at the peak of life. But the journey wasn't over. In fact, it hadn't even begun. The new life started with wide smiles, soft sheets, and a silence Ma mistook for peace. Raymond's house stood in the heart of Enugu's most exclusive estate, Ebeano Hills, a place where the streetlights never flickered and the air always smelled faintly of imported air freshener. The compound was the size of a small community school, surrounded by high gates and electric fencing. The main building stood tall and proud, its walls polished in cream-white marble that gleamed in the morning sun. Ma spent the first week floating, as though life had finally handed her the script she'd written in her mind years ago. The maids bowed when she passed, the chef greeted her with menu options like she was in a boutique hotel, and her closet welcomed her with shelves filled with pre-selected outfits Raymond had ordered weeks before the wedding. She didn't lift a finger, she didn't have to. But in the middle of this curated paradise, something felt off. At first, she couldn't place it. It was like walking into a room and hearing a sound that didn't exist, an uneasiness buried beneath perfection. Raymond barely spoke. He'd leave in the morning without breakfast and return at night long after she had eaten. When she tried to wait for him, he'd walk past her with the indifference of a man who had forgotten what affection was. Still, she brushed it aside. After all, hadn't she prayed for a rich man? He wasn't a poet. He was a provider. And providers didn't waste time on small talk. The change didn't come like an explosion. It crept in like water soaking through concrete. Raymond began to monitor things in the house, not with suspicion, but with precision. He had a folder for everything: fuel receipts, water usage, even the cost of the vegetables the cook brought home. Ma found it odd at first, but laughed it off during a phone call with an old acquaintance, saying, "He's just very organized." It's kind of cute. But soon, the cuteness began to rot. One afternoon, she ordered a wig online, paid for it using her account, and casually mentioned it over dinner. Raymond, who hadn't touched his food, dropped his spoon and asked, "Why are you wasting money on things I didn't approve?" The words hung in the air like bad odor. Ma blinked, confused. "It's my money," she said, half laughing. He didn't flinch. "You're married now. Your decisions affect this house." That night, he removed her ATM card from his driver's file, where he kept all house documents. He said it was for safekeeping. She didn't argue. She told herself it was a small matter. Maybe he was trying to build structure. But the next week, when she asked for 5,000 Nigerian nairas to give her cousin who had just lost her job, he looked her dead in the eye and said, "Do I look like a charity organization to you?" The silence that followed felt heavier than a slap. By the third month, the mansion no longer felt like a home. It felt like a museum with expensive furniture, quiet halls, and a man whose moods moved like weather. Sometimes warm, mostly cold, and always unpredictable. Raymond's words became knives dipped in honey, subtle, slicing, yet delivered with an unnerving calm. He'd make comments like, "I see your hips are getting wider. I hope I didn't marry someone who will expire after one child," and walk away without a second glance. Ma started spending more time with the staff, not out of interest, but for company. The cook, Ngozi, became her reluctant confidant, and even she, in her quiet wisdom, once muttered, "Madam, I hope you're strong." Strong for what? Ma had no idea. But slowly she began to understand. Raymond didn't shout. He didn't raise his hand. But he was always watching. Every action required permission. Every mistake was an opportunity for ridicule. She asked once if she could attend her cousin's introduction in Agbani. He said yes. Then he changed his mind the morning of the event. "You don't need to be everywhere," he said. "You're a married woman now. Behave like it." She canceled. Her cousin was hurt. Ma apologized. But in that apology, she felt a strange guilt that wasn't hers to carry. She was becoming someone else, quieter, smaller, careful. And it terrified her. The day she realized how deeply she had shrunk was the day she found herself asking a maid for 1,000 Nigerian nairas to recharge her phone. It was a small thing, an ordinary, forgettable moment. But it broke something inside her. Here she was, in a house where chandeliers hung like ornaments of power, begging a housemaid for money. She laughed bitterly when the maid offered it without hesitation. That night, she sat by the window, watching the rain fall in slanted lines across the compound, wondering how the fairy tale had turned into a cage. Her phone buzzed with a message from Chioma. an old photo from secondary school. They were in their school uniforms, arms around each other, smiling. The caption read, "Time flies." Ma stared at the image for a long time. It felt like it belonged to a different person. Someone freer. Someone who wasn't afraid to ask for her own money. She didn't respond. She just put the phone down and whispered, "I'm fine," to no one in particular. But even the walls didn't believe her. As the generator hummed in the distance and the guards made their midnight rounds, she curled into the bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to remember what it felt like to sleep without tension in her chest. The mansion was quiet, but her thoughts were loud. And in that silence, she started to hear a question rise from deep within her soul, one she wasn't ready to answer just yet. Had she sold her voice for velvet? In the months that followed, Ma became a woman living on eggshells in her own home. The silence that once passed for peace was now a loaded pause, waiting, breathing, watching her every move. There was a rhythm to Raymond's disdain, and she had unknowingly learned to dance to it. She began to time her words, shorten her sentences, and study his expressions like a student cramming for an unpredictable exam. Every conversation was a test, and she often failed without understanding what rule she had broken. The man she married didn't raise his voice, but his tone was sharp enough to bruise. His insults were dressed in clean English and uttered with such detached calm that it took her a moment to realize she'd just been wounded. He would sit on the leather couch in the living room with a newspaper in one hand, casually commenting, "This house is full of people doing nothing. Some just eat and roam. No value. No output." Ma, seated only a few feet away, would pretend to scroll through her phone as if the words didn't apply to her, even though they pierced like broken glass. She became two people, the one the world saw in carefully curated social media posts, and the one who now whispered thank you to the maid for lending her transport fare. Each day chipped away at her like a sculptor, reshaping her into something less vibrant, more compliant, and painfully aware of every flaw she never knew she had. Her mornings started later than they used to, not because she was lazy, but because getting out of bed felt heavier than it should. The walk from the bedroom to the kitchen was a journey she often paused midway, staring at the perfectly polished staircase and wondering how a place so beautiful could feel so suffocating. The help no longer greeted her with cheer. They watched her the way one watches a bird slowly forget how to fly. On one particular morning, Raymond returned from a business trip unannounced and found Ma asleep at 9 a.m. He stood by the doorway, arms folded, watching her in silence before saying coldly, "Is this what you call being a wife?" She jumped out of bed, embarrassed and confused. "I didn't know you'd be back today," she said quickly, adjusting her robe. He said nothing for a moment, then added with a shrug, "Even when I'm not here, you should behave like someone who married sense." That was the first day she cried in the bathroom for over an hour. She didn't recognize the face in the mirror anymore. The lashes she once wore proudly now felt like burdens, and her skin, though pampered and perfumed, seemed to carry the weight of invisible chains. She knew she was no longer loved, if she ever had been, but worse than that, she wasn't even tolerated. It wasn't just the verbal lashes or the quiet financial control that twisted her reality. It was the consistent erosion of her dignity. She began to forget what laughter sounded like when it wasn't forced. She caught herself apologizing for things she didn't do, over-explaining every decision, and shrinking in spaces where she used to shine. One afternoon, while arranging the drawers in the guest room, she found a file filled with receipts and documents she hadn't seen before, labeled meticulously with her name on each envelope. Expenses she had never asked for were listed in detail. Gown dry cleaning, 6,000 Nigerian nairas. Makeup service, 18,000 Nigerian nairas. Hair installation, 25,000 Nigerian nairas. Every gift, every pampering she once bragged about, was accounted for like a debt she owed. A chill ran through her spine as she realized this wasn't love. This was inventory. Her marriage had become a ledger, and she was the liability being audited daily. When she confronted Raymond that evening with the file in her hand, he didn't flinch. "I don't believe in waste," he said plainly, adjusting his cufflinks. "At least this way, when it ends, we both know the value of what was spent." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning wrapped in indifference. And in that moment, Ma felt the last illusion shatter. This wasn't a man building a life with her. This was a man documenting her worth, preparing for an exit she hadn't seen coming. Still, she stayed. Not because she didn't want to leave, but because leaving felt like defeat, like handing victory to all the people who warned her and watching them nod with the satisfaction of being right. Shame clung to her like a second skin, and pride whispered to her in the dead of night, reminding her that to return to her parents' modest flat in New Haven was to admit that she had married a mirage. So she endured. Days folded into each other, slow and painful. Her body existed in that mansion, but her mind wandered to places where laughter didn't echo with sorrow, and where conversations didn't feel like stepping on landmines. The little girl who once daydreamed about marrying into wealth never imagined this version of wealth. Calculated affection, measured kindness, and love given only when convenient. One day, while dusting the picture frames in the hallway, she came across a photo from their honeymoon in Seychelles. They were smiling, holding hands, standing by the ocean. Her face in the picture looked untouched by worry, and Raymond's arm rested gently on her waist. She stared at that frame for a long time, and then quietly returned it to the shelf. The man in that picture didn't exist anymore. Maybe he never did. Maybe she was so determined to see what she wanted, she ignored everything else. And now, it was too late to wake up from a dream that had already turned into a nightmare. She hadn't been feeling well for a few days. Nausea that clung to her throat like a memory, dizziness that made the polished floors of the mansion feel like a moving train beneath her feet. At first, she dismissed it. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was the silence in the house growing too loud, pressing against her chest like a weight. But as the days stretched and her symptoms lingered, her body began whispering something she could no longer ignore. She took a pregnancy test in the privacy of the guest bathroom, the only place in the house where she still felt invisible. She didn't wait for the result with excitement. She sat on the edge of the bathtub, holding her breath, her fingers trembling slightly. When the 2 lines appeared, her heart didn't leap, it just paused long enough for doubt to settle in. She stared at it like it was a letter from the future. Somewhere inside her, a voice tried to whisper joy. A baby. Life. Maybe things would shift. Maybe Raymond would soften. She held that thought the way a child holds a balloon, carefully, afraid it might float away. That evening, she sat across from him in the living room, her voice calm as she shared the news. He didn't look up from the tablet in his hands. He only said, "All right." No questions. No esmail. No joy. Just a flat word that fell between them like a stone into still water. She waited for something more, but nothing came. The room remained quiet, untouched by emotion. Her hands rested on her lap, and in that moment, she felt a loneliness so sharp it made her shift slightly in her seat, as if moving her body could move the pain too. The pregnancy grew the way silence does, slow, invisible, heavy. Her body ached, not just from the life growing inside her, but from the weight of being unseen. Her appetite changed, her skin dulled, her steps slowed. Raymond noticed none of it, or perhaps he did, but chose to treat it like furniture, there but irrelevant. The house help started to look at her with pity in their eyes, especially Ngozi, who had a mother's softness about her. Ma began to rely on the kindness of strangers who lived in the same house, but never truly spoke. She stopped expecting Raymond to ask how she was feeling. He was either away on trips or locked away in his study. There were days she wouldn't see him until nightfall. When she fainted one afternoon in the living room, she was alone. The TV was still on when she woke up. Her dress was crumpled. Her mouth was dry. It was Ngozi who had found her and fanned her back to consciousness. Later that evening, when Raymond returned and she mentioned the incident, he only said, "You need to eat more carefully." No concern. No urgency. Just the same distance wrapped in polite words. Her body was changing, her needs increasing, but her life remained rooted in neglect. When she started feeling kicks, she didn't rush to tell anyone. The joy had no audience, and the sound of her excitement had long since gone mute. She would talk to her belly in whispers, humming songs from childhood, creating a private world for the child growing inside her, a world where love existed, even if only in soft melodies sung under her breath. Labor came in the early hours of a rainy Monday. The pain gripped her like something alive, something with intention. She tried calling Raymond's phone, but it rang out twice before going off completely. She stumbled down the hallway, clutching her stomach, sweat clinging to her face. The driver was the one who carried her to the car, his face blank but his hands steady. The hospital was cold, bright, and full of voices she didn't know. She gave birth alone. There were no congratulations, no flowers, no warm hand to hold. Just the exhausted sigh of a nurse who handed her the baby and said, "It's a girl." Ma looked at the child, wrinkled, crying real, and something inside her cracked. She named her Kamsio Chukwu. Not because it was trendy, but because it felt true. What I asked of God. She held the baby close, her tears falling silently onto the blanket. For the first time in months, she felt connected to something. Not a man, not a mansion, but this tiny life breathing against her chest. When she returned home, Raymond was in the lounge scrolling through his phone. He looked up once and said, "So it's a girl," then returned to his screen. The child didn't cry, but Ma did, silently, while unpacking baby things in a guest room turned nursery. She no longer tried to understand him. He was a man of surfaces. Glass, wood, steel, nothing soft. She wrapped her daughter in a white shawl that night and whispered, "You will be loved, even if it breaks me." Kamsi cried often in the weeks that followed. Sometimes it was hunger. Sometimes it was heat. Sometimes it was just the echo of a world too harsh for soft beginnings. Ma barely slept. Her days were a cycle of feeding, rocking, pacing, praying. One night, the baby developed a fever. Her small body shook. Her breath became uneven. Ma panicked. She tried everything: cold water, a damp cloth, soft songs. Nothing worked. She rushed to Raymond's room, knocked hard, holding the baby like a lifeline. When he opened the door, his expression was more irritated than concerned. She explained everything: the fever, the strange breathing, the need to go to the hospital immediately. He looked at her, then at the baby, then back at her again. "You're the mother," he said. "Handle it." Then he shut the door. Just like that. She stood there in the hallway barefoot, her nightgown damp with sweat and baby tears, and something inside her shifted. Not broken this time. No, it was sharper. A realization, not a wound. She walked back to the guest room, sat on the floor, and rocked Kamsi in silence. The fever broke by dawn. The child slept. Ma didn't. Her eyes were wide open, not from fear anymore, but from clarity. She could no longer pretend this house was a home. She could no longer lie to herself that silence was strength. She looked at her daughter sleeping beside her and made a quiet vow. This child will never beg for love. Not the way I did. The morning she left, the city of Enugu was still yawning. The sun hadn't fully risen. It was one of those half-lit mornings where everything looked uncertain, like the world itself wasn't sure if it wanted to start the day. Ma had been awake all night, not pacing, not crying, just sitting beside the baby crib with Kamsi sleeping peacefully under a thin white shawl. The room was quiet, too quiet, and it was in that silence that she finally heard herself, really heard herself, for the first time in years. She wasn't thinking about what Raymond would say, or how the neighbors would gossip. She wasn't even thinking about what she would do next. It was the stillness that gave her courage. Not the loud, chest-beating kind of courage, but the quiet kind, the kind that seeps into your bones when you finally stop fighting the truth. Her old self would have needed a plan, a perfect exit strategy, backup funds, and someone to call for help. But she no longer believed in perfection. She believed in escape. Just leaving. Just going. The idea had been growing in her like an unwanted weed, starting as a whisper, then becoming a scream every time Raymond reminded her through his words and his silence that she didn't matter. And when she thought of Kamsi growing up thinking that this was what love looked like, cold shoulders, locked doors, a mother begging through the night, she knew she couldn't stay a day longer. She dressed the baby slowly, not out of fear but reverence. There was something sacred about that moment, something final, like closing a chapter even before you've written the last sentence. She picked up a small baby bag she had quietly packed 2 days earlier and checked it one last time. 2 diapers, a wrapper, a feeding bottle, and 5,000 naira notes folded deep into a side pocket. That money had come from Ngozi, who had pretended not to know why Madam needed cash so early in the month. But Ngozi had been watching. All of them had. Even the gatekeeper, who once muttered under his breath that Oga no day like nonsense, had started opening the gates for her with pity instead of protocol. When she walked past the long corridor of the mansion, every wall seemed to echo with the memories she didn't want anymore. The night she fainted and Raymond didn't call, the afternoon she found the receipts of her life catalogued like groceries, the hours she spent crying in silence while posting filtered pictures online to keep up the charade. Her shoes didn't make a sound on the marble floor. She passed the dining table, the couch, the grand chandelier above the staircase. Every expensive item seemed to look at her like an accomplice, like they knew they had been part of the lie. When she reached the back door, her hands trembled, not from fear but from release. The kind of trembling that comes when a body that has carried too much finally decides to drop the weight. She didn't use the main gate. That one had too many eyes, too much memory. Instead, she slipped through the staff exit beside the outdoor laundry shed, the same narrow path the cleaners used to dispose of trash and rinse mops. It smelled faintly of bleach and leftover rice, but to her, it smelled like freedom. The gate was unlocked. She didn't look back. There was nothing worth glancing at, not the white SUV Raymond always polished every weekend, not the swing she had asked him to build for Kamsi, but which remained untouched, not even the security camera blinking like an uninterested witness. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that belonged to early market traders and tired security men returning to their families. She walked fast, her legs light, as if they had been waiting years to run. Kamsi whimpered once, but didn't cry. It was like the baby, too, understood that silence was no longer safety. At the junction, she flagged down a Kiki that looked too old to still be on the road, but she didn't care. She just said, "A bakpa," and the driver nodded like he didn't need to hear the rest. Her voice was hoarse, like it hadn't spoken in weeks. As they sped off through the winding roads of Enugu, past churches and car lots, she looked down at her daughter sleeping in her lap and whispered something only the child could hear. "You will never know what it feels like to beg for love." It wasn't a promise. It was a vow. Abakpa was different from Ebiano Hills in every way imaginable. It didn't smell like imported candles or air freshener. It smelled like onions frying in reused oil and damp earth after rainfall. The buildings were low, the shops were cramped, the streets were uneven, and the people looked like they had seen too much life to pretend anymore. It was here that Chioma lived, in a one-room flat that sat above a provision store that sold everything from bread to baby powder. Ma hadn't called ahead. She had no phone. She had no plan. Just a name and an address she remembered from years ago, tucked in the back of her mind like a safety pin. When Chioma opened the door that morning, she didn't scream or ask why. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't mention the time Ma mocked her husband's income or laughed at her wedding gown. She simply stepped aside and said, "Come in." Ma stood there for a moment, tears rushing to her eyes, her mouth quivering with 100 unspoken words. But she said nothing. She just stepped inside, removed her shoes, and collapsed on the edge of the mattress like someone who had been running for years. The room smelled of talcum powder and kerosene, and it was the most comforting scent she'd inhaled in months. Chioma held the baby and said softly, "She's beautiful." "What's her name?" Ma exhaled deeply, then replied, "Kamsiochukwu." Chioma nodded, touched the child's cheek, and said, "God truly listens." The days that followed moved like an old song, slow, careful, wrapped in memories that refused to loosen their grip. In Chioma's small room, Ma discovered something she hadn't felt in years, quiet without fear. There were no footsteps to anticipate, no eyes watching from across a dining table, no cold silences curled up between sentences. Instead, there was routine, soft and predictable. Mornings began with the sound of Chioma's husband dragging his sewing machine into the corner of the room, and Ma bathing Kamsi in a blue plastic basin set near the window. The sunlight touched them gently, and even though the air was thick with the scent of petrol from the downstairs generator, it felt more honest than any of the diffusers from Raymond's mansion. In the evenings, they sat outside by the stairs with their feet bare and their stories unfiltered. Chioma never asked for explanations. She simply listened. Sometimes that's all a person needs, not a lecture or an opinion, just a place to sit and be. Ma found herself laughing again. Not the stiff, photo-ready giggle she used to wear like makeup, but a deep, full sound that came from the part of her that hadn't been touched in years. Kamsi began to crawl, reaching for things she didn't understand, wooden spoons, wrappers, slippers. Everything was new to her, and through her daughter's eyes, Ma began to see the world again, not as something to survive, but something to feel. There was no shame in that room, no gold-plated frame to hide behind. Just breath, body, and time. She found small ways to contribute, insisting on fetching water from the shared tap behind the building, helping Chioma measure fabric and sort buttons while the baby napped. It wasn't about money, it was about meaning. Something had shifted in her, something quiet but irreversible. She didn't speak of Raymond, not even when she overheard his name mentioned on a radio program one afternoon while waiting to buy tomatoes. The voice said his company was under investigation, that assets were being frozen, that court hearings were looming. Ma stood there for a moment, her purse clutched loosely in her hand, the smell of fried fish drifting from a nearby kiosk. Her mind didn't race. Her heart didn't pound. She just blinked and moved on. That chapter had closed itself, not with a bang, but with a sigh. The city still carried remnants of him, of course, the corners of Enugu where she used to walk in silence, the boutiques she once entered with pride, the streets where his Range Rover once turned heads. But now those places felt like dreams borrowed from someone else's sleep. The woman who had once built her worth around a man's money no longer existed. In her place stood someone softer, but stronger. A woman who knew that dignity doesn't always come wrapped in lace and champagne flutes. Sometimes it comes in the form of a plastic chair, a crying child, and a friend who says, "Rest. I've got you." One day, while shopping in Envied market with Chioma, someone from her past recognized her. A woman from her wedding committee, Ada, well-dressed, well-perfumed, eyes like searchlights. She stared for a moment, eyes widening with the kind of curiosity only gossip can feed. "Ma," she asked, stepping forward, her voice laced with disbelief. Ma turned slowly, adjusting the scarf on her head, the baby sleeping in a wrapper strapped across her back. "Yes," she replied simply. Ada blinked, unsure of what to say next. There was too much history in the air, too many unspoken things clawing their way to the surface. I heard things," Ada stammered, looking her over, as if waiting for a confession or a breakdown. But Ma smiled, not the kind of smile that demanded attention, but the kind that said, "I've walked through fire and found water." She looked at Ada for a moment and said, "Take care of yourself," then turned and continued walking, her footsteps unhurried. Chioma caught up beside her, carrying onions and pepper in a yellow nylon bag, and said nothing. They understood each other in that silence. Pride no longer lived where peace had taken root. It wasn't the world's approval Ma needed anymore. It was her own. And in that moment, surrounded by the noise of hawkers and bus conductors, she felt taller than she ever did in heels, fuller than she ever did in designer gowns. There was no applause. No one clapped. But inside her, something had finally healed. She never went back to the mansion, not even to collect her things. The thought of returning, even for closure, felt like picking up shards of glass just to prove she'd once been cut. Instead, she focused on building something new. Chioma helped her rent a small one-room shop not far from their street, where she started selling baby clothes and affordable women's items. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. Her name was painted in faded blue across the top, Mama Kamsi's Boutique. People started to come, neighbors, local midwives, even school teachers. She smiled at every customer, offered change with gratitude, and never once boasted about her past. Kamsi began to walk, clinging to the walls of the shop, giggling every time her mother called her name. On one quiet afternoon, as Ma was folding baby socks and humming a tune she couldn't quite remember the lyrics to, she paused and looked around. The shelves were half empty. The floor had dust. The fan was old. But her heart was clean. She picked up Kamsi, held her close, and whispered again, "You will never beg to be seen." Outside, the city of Enugu moved with its usual rhythm. Buses honking, radios playing, people haggling over prices. But inside that small shop, time slowed for just a second, as if the world, too, was giving her space to breathe. Not to be perfect, not to impress, just to exist. And for the first time in a long time, that was more than enough. Sometimes what glitters isn't gold, it's glass catching the sunlight, beautiful but fragile. Don't trade your peace for packaging. Don't choose loud applause over quiet joy. Learn to look beyond what the eyes can see. If love doesn't come with kindness, respect, and safety, it's not love, it's a performance. And life is too long to act through pain. Walk away from anything that demands you lose yourself just to keep it. You're not hard to love. You're not asking for too much. You're just asking the wrong person. May your heart never settle for what breaks it. May your eyes see truth before deception wears a smile. May your peace be louder than any storm life sends your way. May you never enter a house that looks like heaven but feels like hell. May your laughter return in full, not half. May your next chapter be filled with gentle hands, soft words, and rooms that don't echo with loneliness. May love find you and stay, not because of what you have, but because of who you are. And above all, may your life rise from the ashes of regret into joy that no man can take. If you receive this, say a loud amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.